here. What's up, everybody? It's your favorite navigating apps favorite nerd. Today we are talking about the direction of Takara Tomy Masterpiece. This is a discussion video that a lot of people have wanted to see, and I've been looking forward to doing. I just knew it was going to be a lot of work, and I've been overloaded with a lot of toys coming in, so we just haven't had the time. But now we have the time. For those that are interested, I'm sure Masterpiece Megs will be next week, probably Monday. That's my plan anyway. So real quick, to lay the ground rules once again for those who are new. I always try to reply to everybody's comments on my videos, but for discussion videos, those are the one exception I make where I don't reply. I say pretty much everything I have to say, and then I just sort of leave the door unlocked for everybody to come in and leave their thoughts without mine getting in the way of theirs, since theirs can't get in the way of mine. So we're starting with MP10, because MP10 is the relaunch, right? MP10 is what started this idea of having a collector grade Transformer collection that were all in scale with one another and seen part of one cohesive line. So MP10 is a game changer in that regard and was really amazing for its day. I have to say that I could go for an update for a Masterpiece Prime at this point. There are some things about this thing that irritate me now, but it's still a really good toy. Now, this is the Hasbro version. I don't have the Takara version. I started getting back into Transformers around the time that Hasbro released their MP10, so that's what we're looking at here, but the same principles will basically apply. So a lot of people have often said that Masterpiece is, or its intention rather, is to find this balance between toy and cartoon and all this sort of stuff. And I'm not sure I necessarily agree with that, but for the sake of that discussion, we're going to put the G1 and the cartoon image up now. Now, what this did was it came with a ton of accessories. It came with a limited amount of paint applications in terms of what we eventually see in the line, and it came with some of the things that we had already kind of understood or expected from the Transformers Masterpiece line, which is to say incredible engineering, better sculpt work, and kind of a lot of flash and flare. We got chromed out pieces, we have die cast, we have translucent plastics and paint and flat plastics, etc. So we just have a lot of things that sort of make it feel like it's of a premium line. Now, looking at these images, I really don't see anything that is indicative of the G1 toy. What I do see is a fairly faithful representation of the cartoon image, but it's not as simple as the cartoon image. There are a lot of things here, a lot of sculpt work designs that are different than the cartoon image. If you look at the images if you look at the line work on his thighs, if you look at the line work on his obliques, right? All these little elements here that are part of the truck, a lot of the sculpt work in the forearms and stuff. Tons of layers and levels to the calves, which is just one of those things that makes it a more interesting, more complex looking thing than the G1 cartoon. The G1 cartoon is very simplistic. The G1 cartoon is very plain. It's very straightforward, and there is more complexity to this. There is more interesting things going on. This whole side piece here on the side of the leg, which beefs out the calves, that's all specific to this toy. It's not here on the toy image. The toy doesn't have that same covering, and it's not here in the cartoon image where it's just straightforward. And what we have as a result is a more dynamic looking, a more interesting looking sculpt that seems more mech, and it has a bit more components to it that just make it visually striking. All this stuff here inside the calf, tons of little line work and panel work and pistons and so on and so forth. A lot of sculpt work that we see there. Sculpt work in the shoulders. Now the ankles are something that we can talk about on another day, but you know, all this sculpt work, it just makes it a more interesting looking thing at the end of the day. Now, everything else I think is Takara, but this is the MP11 mold. This is an update of their previous Seeker mold, which cleaned up the feet a little bit and made a couple little alterations. The side panels are gone now on the hips and giving it a much more cartoon image. Now, here's the G1 cartoon image and the G1 toy image. Now, once again, I don't see anything really from the toy here. I'm not sure what I would have wanted to see from the toy here, to be honest, but I don't see it here. But let's talk about the cartoon image. So once again, a much more interesting piece visually than what the cartoon had to offer, as we should expect, in my opinion. It just has a more mature look. Tons of sculpt work, all in the obliques again, in the pelvis, on the legs. If you look at the legs over there, there's not a single piece of line work in the cartoon legs. Tons of sculpt work here, especially in the universal joint there, the knees and so forth. Now you could argue that the knees need that in order to be functional, and I would agree. But you don't need this here at the top of the thigh. You don't need any of that in the hips. You don't need any of this detail and sculpt work and line work in the calves and so forth. And all of that stuff ends up giving it a more interesting and unique look. Same with the forearms here. All those line works. You don't see that in the cartoon image. And that's what made this guy, I think, look interesting. And what Masterpiece was able to do, especially in the beginning, and one of the places where I will concede there is a toy influence, is they were able to do stuff with the engineering that made it somewhat reminiscent of the toy experience when you were a kid. And outside of that, they were able to give you articulation that you've never really had in a G1 style Transformer figure, and a very imposing and impressive looking piece on your shelf. Now, when they redid this, they probably should have figured out a way to give him a waist swivel, but that's a conversation for a different day. But what we ultimately have is a figure that's highly articulated, decently painted. It's not over the top in terms of its paint, but it has enough paint apps where it is at least presentable. We have die cast once again, and we have a piece that is very indicative of the G1. There's the components that are iconic that make it such. It has some engineering cues that are reminiscent of the G1 toy, the same with Prime. But in terms of the sculpt, and in terms of the line work and the overall presentation, it's a bit more grown up than the G1 cartoon image. And now we've continued to see this trend of something that has all of the iconic pieces. You know, what makes Starscream, right? The shape of the helmet, the face, these bits here, of course the null rays, the red with the cockpit in the center, the wings, like all those things are right on the money. But what it does is it adds on top of that a lot of things that we see in other mature mech lines like Gundams or shout out to Magid, Macross and stuff like that, where they have a lot of panel line work and a lot of little intricacies that make it seem as though it's almost more realistic than we've ever seen it before. And then later on, they'll go on to beat this mold all the way into the ground until you can no longer stand up, lay your eyes on it. But that doesn't change the fact of kind of how well this one was done. Which brings us to MP12. Now, this was another game changer in the line, because what this did provide a more affordable release. It added in the idea of getting the proper licenses for the vehicles, which may have become more of a burden than an incentive later on down the line. And it got heavy on the paint. But what it continued to do was provide interesting and unique engineering and cartoon reminiscent sculpt work. Now, it's pretty far from being cartoon accurate. His chest is wider proportionately. The lower legs almost look nothing like the cartoon image. But we have enough things that make it close enough where it still gives you a cartoon feel. For instance, the shoulder sculpt work. This little line work here down the shoulder is indicative of the cartoon image. The red lines on top on the side of the white blocks for the forearms. The general color breakup of red, white, black, like all that stuff makes you feel and makes you remember the cartoon, although it looks not a whole lot like it, but it gives you enough of those iconic pieces where it's unmistakably Sideswipe. Now here is an example where you can see a little bit more of the toy's influence. This one little breakup in the lower legs and so forth, but it's still a pretty far cry from the toy. But we have finished paint work, and we have tons of interesting sculpt work and line work throughout that we don't really see on either the toy nor the cartoon image. But it is still true to both the MP11 and MP10 molds in how it presents itself. It all looks like it walked out of the same world. And the excitement of that mixed with the lower price point with still the same incentives but for smaller figures made Takara Tomy's Masterpiece line, especially for its time, extremely exciting, because then it kind of blew out the doors of what was possible. I think before this, we pretty much just thought we were going to get the key players, you know, your Optimus, your Megatron, your Starscreams, your Soundwaves, etc. And the idea of getting a Sideswipe, and then of course the repaints that Sideswipe allows you to get, I think really opened a lot of people's eyes to the fact that, like, you know, they could theoretically do anything they want. But it still was in this masterpiece, almost reimagination of G1, which to me is a much more interesting aesthetic than anything we had seen before. And what made it fascinating was while it was new and interesting, it still was very expressive of how G1 felt to you. Which brings us to MP13, which in my opinion is the best masterpiece ever made. And possibly the best transforming figure ever made. And the reason why is because I think it does everything the most successfully. But that's not why we're here today. So once again, we see a lot of things that are indicative of the cartoon in terms of overall silhouette and sort of, you know, obviously the iconic things that make Soundwave, the tape box in the chest, the bit on the shoulder, etc. And here we even see a little bit of stuff that's reminiscent of the toy. If you look at the shoulders especially, and the idea of using silver instead of white. Now, what this did was it did everything that we've talked about before, especially with MP12, where now you have the sculpt, the engineering, you have mature looking figures on the strength of this, all this line panel work and these little details throughout that give it a much more realistic almost looking idea of if this thing were to be real, it would be more complex than just this simple white boxes on the cartoon imagery. Along with that, we get tons of paint, all the articulation you'd want, the sculpt, etc. Another thing that we should look at is the face. Now, I know this image is blurry on the cartoon image, but the head sculpt here is a lot more menacing than most of the cartoon imagery, which also gives it a more believable look for this world. We also have tons of details in the shoulder that aren't on the cartoon, but are on the toy. But be that as it may, it doesn't make this look any more toy-ish. If anything, it makes it the opposite. And even stuff that I think by today's standards, a lot of people would consider to be kibble, like this stuff on the side of the leg, to me, it ends up making it more interesting. Not only is it a relatively smart way to kind of, you know, put that kibble that from the transformation process, but it doesn't look out of place. It looks like it could belong as part of the figure. We also saw that on MP12 with the bit that covers down on the joint in front of the ankle. It's a lot of those types of decisions that end up making, like, taking problems, potential problems with making the figure efficient and turn it into aesthetic cues that seem more mature. Now, I will briefly, I'm not going to go over them in any great detail, but I will briefly mention the tapes. I think the tapes that were overall a disappointment, to me anyway. I think the problem with the tapes is that it's a double-edged sword, or a double-edged sword, you might say, is that they had to fit into the chest box. If they didn't fit into the chest box, everybody would have cried and moaned and complained, and I get it. But as a result, they were really limited with what they could do, and they were really limited in keeping it in the scale that you want. You know, there's an awful lot of mass shifting that takes place in the cartoon as you remember it from the size of those guys fitting into the chest compartment to how big they actually were once they were standing on ground. So, this is one of those things where just the character design was working against them from the beginning. So I'm not going to get too far into it. But even with that being said, I think that the Laserbeak was perfect. Like, I think that is also perfect. So, like, this release that came with just him and Laserbeak, I think is a perfect release. And I rarely use that word perfect, but I think it is a perfect release. Now, don't mind Rat Bat. He's on this makeshift stand that a friend of mine made for me that plugs into the back of him, but he obviously didn't come with the release. But that being said, we have everything that we wanted here. We have paint, we have articulation, we have sculpt, we have silhouette, we have an interesting engineering, we have accessories at the wazoo, we had everything that we wanted, and it still stayed true to the motif that we had come to expect from the line before it, where everything seemed like it was part of the same world. and the Dotson mold. Now, this is where we start to see the licensing issues really become a bit of a hindrance. And it still works like a champ. This is a great figure, it's a great mold. But we start to see a little bit of limitations in terms of what they can do to capture the accuracy of the cartoon image because of the shape of the hood. We just see it more here, I think, than we've seen it in the past, but it still is not a problem. And it still stays relatively true to the cartoon. Now, the shape of the foot definitely plays to the cartoon, but it also plays to the G1 toy. But I don't see anything that's super indicative of the G1 toy that's any more so than the cartoon. So I still don't think that the toy is playing into it in any significant manner. Now, what we do see are still tons of those same aesthetic cues. If you look at the abdomen, all those little pieces of line work inside the abdomen. This line here is consistent in both this and the cartoon, but we had this extra piece here, and all those little things, all these little detailings here for the car and so forth, lend itself to that interesting look we've been talking about. And this is one of the beautiful things that Takara was able to do, was kind of capture those, like we keep talking about. Like I'm starting to sound like a broken record, like these iconic pieces, you know, the chest, the tires on the back of the arm, the wings, the shape of the feet, etc. Updating it without breaking any of those character rules, and still giving you everything else. And this is also consistent with their kind of take on making sure that the figure has a beautiful finish that we see on all three of these releases. This striking, glossy paint finish that just catches your eye from across the room and stays consistent with its previous releases, and still able to give little character nuances and changes to make all three look unique in their own way. Of course, more obvious with Smokescreen, but you can still see it in just the different options for the shoulder pieces with Blue Streak. And Wheeljack. Now, this lacked the finish, but it had enough paint apps throughout where you don't really notice it. All that green and red paint, all the Tampo paint, all those things really ended up, you know, kind of providing enough for this figure where you didn't notice any lack with the white finish. Still had those character traits from the cartoon that make it kind of known universally as Wheeljack. The head sculpt, but as you can even see, even with the head sculpt, the ears are slightly more exaggerated, and that ends up giving it a different look, but a more interesting look, I think, in my opinion. You could argue that those are more reminiscent of the toy, and I wouldn't debate that with you. It stays true with all of the nuances that we've come to expect from the line, and gives us different panel work. So as you can see in the cartoon image, he has a very specific look for the legs. Those legs are not used as a guide to design these legs, especially like I'm speaking about in the thigh area specifically. But instead, we get a different set of line work that looks more appropriate for the line, but also visually interesting enough where it's not a distracting component. We have tons of more line work both in the calves, the shins, and the feet, as well as in the shoulder and such. But it is getting simpler. Not necessarily in engineering, not necessarily in paint work, but in the way it presents itself, it is getting simpler. We're still seeing the line work, we're still seeing the sculpt come through, and the nuances, you know, and the mature look sort of shine, but it is mainlining a bit. And this release to me is where things started to change. Now, I know around this time they were getting ready to go through a transition in lead designer. I understand all that. I understand that that's a key component of it. I understand that it gets, you know, more obvious around the Ultra Magnus point, which we will get to. But for me, even before the new designer took over, this is where you could start to see it shift gears a bit. Now, I think this guy is where people started to notice a change in quality. Now, I'll be honest, I don't have as many issues with this fella as others seem to. Once again, obviously, this is a Sunbow stock image. Like, it's not like a proper cartoon image, but I think for these purposes, it's close enough. What's staying consistent? We're getting this paint finish. It's brilliant. We're dealing with the licensing of the cars. As a result, the feet look off. Not to mention the vehicle mode, obviously. We had one bizarre situation, which I think most of us found bizarre. If you look at my review of this figure, it's one of my favorite skits actually for that one, but this panel here was a piece that had to move, and this opening stayed open, and for some reason with a Takara masterpiece, that seems wrong. But we're still getting the articulation, we're still getting the silhouette, we're still getting the paint, we're still getting the sculpt, we're still getting interesting line work, but not as much. Now you could argue that that's because this is a smaller piece, and I wouldn't be the one to pick that debate with you. But at least we're still getting some. We're seeing it in the forearms as well. So I think for a figure this size, it pretty much stays true to the previous releases and the kind of way that Masterpiece had been doing business. I think one of those things just off the top of my head that we got small universals for hips instead of ball joints. I think that was a nice touch. But I think that this pretty much stays true to form. It's just we're dealing with a smaller figure and a limitation regarding character design as a result of the car license. But I still think this did enough right. And I still think it maintains that very interesting aesthetic, even though it's starting to get simpler. Another reason why we're seeing a little bit more of the simplicity here is because a large portion of the vehicle makes up the aesthetics of the bot. And as a result, they can't change too much due to the license. We get back to that license issue, the reoccurring issue of that license. But we're all of these issues are due to constraints, right? They're due to licensing constraints. They're due to size constraints. It's not any sort of corner cutting, in my opinion. MP22. Now this was my wake-up call. This was my wake-up call that something about the way they were doing business had changed. But let's talk about what remained the same. The silhouette, still there. Decent materials, still there. However, we're seeing weaker ratchets proportionately. We're seeing weaker articulation. The ankles didn't give you as much, the shoulders didn't give you as much. Not the biggest deal in the world, but not what we had come to expect. We're also seeing this bit of business hanging on the infamous butt flap. Now, of course, as we've discussed already, all of these guys have taken liberties in their aesthetic cues and design. But of all the bots we've looked at so far, none have had a piece of kibble so intrusive. Let's talk about other things. The paint, where is it? And this was an expensive masterpiece. Now it's a big masterpiece, so obviously some of that makes sense. But some things have started to change. We're still seeing the sculpt work, we're not seeing the paint, things are getting simpler. The engineering here is even arguably simpler. Now, you could argue that that's because of the design of the character, and once again, I wouldn't really pick that argument with you, but it's definitely something that's worth mentioning. I think that this is much more in line with the cartoon than most of the previous releases. Obviously, there's been some exceptions. Soundwave was more in line. Prime is more in line, but even Soundwave and Prime are enough of a departure. This one seems much closer, both in spirit and in approach, let alone how it ultimately looks. Now, some would say that that's what they've been looking for their whole life, and that's fine. That's not what this is about. This isn't really about whether or not that choice is good nor bad. This is about the line changing and evolving over time. It's up to you to make a decision as to how you feel about it. I remember when this guy was released, there was a lot of people that were saying, well, you didn't have a problem with X Masterpiece release or Y Masterpiece release. And that's true. However, when this was released, the competition among third parties had gotten stiffer. And as a result, Masterpiece is held to a higher standard. Why? Because Masterpiece has always been the line to set the standard, to set the bar that other companies reach toward and never really touched, with maybe the exception of Quakewave, at least until this point. But around this point, things started changing. You started seeing a few third-party companies releasing Masterpiece scaled figures that was surpassing, in the eyes of some, myself included, what Takara Tomy was officially releasing. But this wasn't a bad figure, and while it may not be as good as some of their other releases, I'm sure you're familiar with the expression, one monkey don't stop no show. It's not as though one release that's slightly lower in standard is enough reason to write off a company. I mean, if that were the case, we wouldn't be collecting anything, because nobody is batting 1,000 or 100 if you're a real sports player. But this is an obvious change. Now, this was also at the height of the transitional period, so we're not exactly sure what took place behind the scenes that affected the official release of this fella. But nonetheless, a change was in works. Now, we're only going to talk about this guy briefly, and that's because I'm not breaking him down, and he is a bit of a bear to work with. But this was MP24, and here
This was the first real masterpiece that I was disappointed with. Some people falsely assumed that that was because I wasn't familiar with the character, but you know, I'm wrong from time to time, and so is most of the world. The reason why I was disappointed with this is because we saw a tremendous lack of paint. We saw a tremendous lack of style. A lot of this was very slavish to the cartoon. We also saw weaker joints that we're not used to seeing. You know, I had to put upgrades on this guy. That was the first time I really felt like I had to put upgrades on. Now you can make the argument that I had to do that because of the upgrade kit from KFC, and I wouldn't argue with that either, but I did have to have an upgrade just for the elbow to hold the shield. Now that is something I wasn't used to with this company, and this is definitely in the midst of that change, and this is when I really start to see them make a left turn. If Ultra Magnus was them putting their blinker on, this was them getting on the exit.